Well, thanks very much indeed, Millicent, and thank you to the Frontline Club for organising this. I'm Edward Lucas, and I'm the international editor of The Economist and author of a book on Russia. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Bill Browder and Masha Gessen, who has just produced what I think may be the book on Putin. And I've known Bill for a long time, I've known Masha for a long time, I've read Masha's book, and it was so good I sat down and read it again. It's got some sensational stuff about both the kind of inner architecture of the Putin regime and also Putin the person. But you haven't come to hear me, you've come to hear them. So what we're going to do is they're going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to have what I hope will be a very lively discussion. And I'd remind you that hostile questions are much more interesting than friendly ones. So if you just want to say, isn't this all just great, then save it. But if you want to say that we're all talking nonsense, that's much more interesting. So I'm going to start off with just asking Masha to outline the key points in your book. And I think the two things that really struck me was, first of all, the way you argued that the sort of St. Petersburg hybrid of organised crime and FSB had sort of mutated in St. Petersburg and then taken over the whole country. That was sort of the first really dramatic point. And the second one was your really devastating portrayal of Putin as a particularly exotic form of kleptomaniac. So perhaps you'd like to just...
Thank you, Ed. Right, so the exotic form of kleptomania, actually, I don't think it's kleptomania. We've been calling this regime a kleptocracy. And when I was writing the chapter on his relationship to material things, or one of the chapters on his relationship to material things, I got interested in the definition of kleptomania and discovered, to my great surprise, that part of the definition of kleptomania is that people tend to steal things that are worthless and that they don't need, which is not exactly what Putin does. So I started looking for a diagnosis. I promise it's the only armchair diagnosis in the book. But I started looking for a better term for this, and I discovered that there's this term pleonexia, which is the irresistible desire to possess things that do not rightfully belong to you, which seemed to fit the picture much better. This is, I was interested in writing a book that didn't just detail what has happened under Putin in Russia, which to a large extent is well known. I was interested in writing the story of this person who's done what he's done in Russia. So I was particularly interested in any thread that I could follow from his childhood to his time as president. And one of those threads was his relationship to material things. Right? He was the only child in his first grade class who had a wristwatch, which at the time was spectacularly luxurious. I mean, even adults in 1952 rarely had wristwatches. So here was this boy with a wristwatch. Which doesn't really tell us much about him, but it does tell us a little bit about the circumstance. Then when he gets a little older, when he's in college, his parents win the lottery, and they win a car. And they have the choice of taking the car or taking cash. And the cash would have been enough to get them out of a communal apartment and into a new construction flat. But Putin takes the car, the college student. So he has to have been the only college student in Leningrad at the time who had his own car. And that points to something that's very peculiar. I mean, that kind of non-differential relationship to his parents, who were elderly, who were both retired at the time. He was an only child. He would have been expected to bring money home, not take what they had won in the lottery. Now, getting to the subject of bringing money home, he spends 2 summers working in construction in the far north, which is common for college students at the time. And he makes huge amounts of money by the standards of those times. And the first summer, he takes that money and he blows it all on a vacation on the Black Sea. And the next summer, he decides to be more frugal, so he actually goes back to Leningrad with the money and buys an overcoat and a cake for his mother. Now, this is what's interesting about this is that this is stuff that he has actually told himself, because one of the things that I found actually very rewarding as a biographer is that Putin had no public record before he became president. You know, he had been in the secret police his whole life. So anything that became known about him is stuff that he wanted known about him, right? Whether consciously or not quite. This is what he wanted to put forward. This is who he thought he was, right? Which at first glance may not seem like such good luck for a biographer, but I think it is. It's a meta text, and his official biography, which was written in cooperation with 3 journalists hastily in February 2000, is amazing in that sense, because I really got to see what he wanted to put forward. What he wanted to put forward was an image of himself as a thug, as somebody who had trouble controlling his temper, somebody who was aggressive, and somebody who was vengeful. And basically, you could argue we had fair warning in February 2000. That's exactly who he turned out to be.
And can you explain a bit more about the regime? Because there's Putin the person, or Putin the thug, as you describe him, but he sits at the apex of a regime that has its roots in the 1990s, but is quite different from Russia of the 1990s, has some roots in the Soviet era, but is also totally different from the Soviet Union. Could you characterize this regime a bit for us? What's it based on? How does it work?
I think Putin sincerely believes that the KGB is the best thing ever invented. And he has done everything in his power, and that's a lot, to reshape Russia in the image of the KGB. Right? So what's the KGB? The KGB is a closed system that's based on personal connections and paranoia, where information comes in but doesn't go out. And that's very much the system he has constructed. One of the key differences between the KGB, the current system that's based on the KGB, and the system that existed in the Soviet Union was that, in fact, the Soviet Union rested on 2 pillars. There was the Communist Party system, and then there was the KGB system. At times they were in competition. They did correct one another's misinformation some of the time. After a while, and this is the time when Putin actually got to the KGB sort of ballooned out of proportion and was no longer able to digest the information that it was collecting. And it can be argued that that's one of the factors that contributed to the demise of the Soviet Union. Was that the KGB had become dysfunctional. Now, in Putin, we have somebody who came out of that dysfunctional iteration of the KGB and tried to recreate Russia as the sort of vertically controlled, closed system, and that's very much what we have now. So it can be compared to mafia state, which which has been done, and that's a very good comparison. I think it's very effectively compared to a pyramid structure, and it is a pyramid structure in all sorts of ways, right? And one of the important things to keep in mind is that it has to keep bringing in more participants in order for the system to be sustained. And once that process stops, the system will collapse.
But Masha, many people listening to that are going to say, well, hang on a moment. There are plenty of countries in the world that are blessed or cursed by natural resources, and where the people in charge loot those natural resources or extract rents from them. There are plenty of countries which have got corrupt bureaucracies, and the people at the top extract bureaucratic rents from those bureaucracies. Why is the system in Russia so worthy of note? What's so different about it? Why is this really worse than what happens in, say, Mexico or Nigeria or some other country?
I think it was you, Edward, who wrote once that that Russians keep saying, but in the rest of the world, but in the rest of the world. But in fact, the rest of the world is just like Russia. It is corrupt and poorly governed. And it's true. Russia is like much of the rest of the world. Russia happens to be the largest landmass. Russia happens to have one of the 2 largest arsenals of nuclear arms. I think that's reason enough to pay attention to the fact that it is poorly governed, if governed at all, and is extremely corrupt and on the verge of collapse.
Right. Well, we've been talking slightly, if not abstract, at least general terms. And I now want to turn to Bill Browder to look at one of the most glaring casualties of this regime, which is your lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. Now, I know this is an immensely complicated story, and it's really difficult to get across to people who don't know it, because they say things like, but why didn't he call the police? when yet the police were actually the perpetrators. So, Bill, I'm going to ask you to do the impossible and try and give us at least the highlights or the lowlights of this story in a few minutes, and then I'll come back with some more questions and tease out some of the details.
Good. First of all, let me just tell you, there's a lot of terrible stories in Russia. Sergei Magnitsky's story is just one of many, many stories. But the reason that I'm here tonight is that Sergei Magnitsky's story is featured in Masha's book at the very end, and in Edward's book, this one, at the very beginning. Chapter 1 is about Sergei Magnitsky. And so, why are both books featuring the story? Because the story of Sergei Magnitsky, which I'll tell you simply and quickly in a nutshell, is the story of how bad things have gotten in Russia. It's sort of the emblematic story of the bare face of Russia from the beginning to the end. Just a little bit about me. I recognize about 20% of the faces in the audience for those who I don't know or don't know me. I was at one point the largest foreign portfolio investor in Russia. I ran an investment fund called the Hermitage Fund, which grew from nothing to about $4.5 billion of money invested in the Russian stock market. I discovered in my life as an investor that all the companies that I was investing in, all the Russian companies, were basically losing all the money that they should have been sharing with the shareholders to a bunch of corrupt officials and corrupt management. And I decided to do something about it, which was to publicize the corruption by researching how it was done and then sharing it with the Economist and the Wall Street Journal and various other newspapers. And as you can probably imagine, that didn't make me a very popular figure in Russia. And in 2005, I was expelled from the country. And then the real trouble began, and the real trouble was something that is truly heartbreaking. In about 18 months after I was expelled,
So, Bill Howard, you need to be sitting down for this story, so the people standing at the back should try and find some. There's a space here, space there, and some comfortable ones there. Sorry, Bill, carry on.
No problem. Actually, let me just say something that after I was expelled from Russia, I had the good fortune of not wanting to suffer the same fate as Michael Hordakovsky, and I was able to sell everything that we had in Russia quickly and quietly, and to get all of our money out of the country. And people often ask me, how is it possible that you're able to sell everything and get your money out of the country? And I have a very interesting analysis of Russia, or the Russian regime, which is that they're truly evil, but they're actually very incompetent at executing their evil. And I've seen this in lots of different ways. And so I was able to get all our money and also get all of our people out of Russia, and all my employees. And so I thought that I was relatively immune from their clutches. 18 months after I was expelled, which is quite a long time if considering what had happened, the 25 police officers raided my office in Moscow, and 25 more police officers raided the office of my American law firm. And they were specifically looking for the stamps and seals and certificates from the investment companies through which we had invested all of our money in Russia. One of the lawyers at the law firm protested their seizure of these documents, and they took him into a conference room and beat him so badly that he was hospitalized for 3 weeks. The documents were then seized, and then the next thing we knew, we no longer owned our investment holding companies. And these were companies that were empty at this point because we had taken all of our money out of the country. But the police didn't know that. And using the documents seized from our law firm's office, they fraudulently re-registered the companies out of our name into the name of a man who had been convicted of murder and let out of jail after 1 year by the Interior Ministry, presumably to put his name on companies that they were stealing. I was shocked and mortified, not because there was any economic harm to me because we had got all our money out, but I thought if the police were working together with murderers to steal our companies, God knows what else is going to happen. And I hired 7 lawyers from 4 different law firms to help me decipher and uncover this mess, including a young man named Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei was a 36-year-old lawyer working for the American law firm Firestone Duncan. And for those in Moscow who knew him, he was one of the smartest lawyers of his generation in Russia. And Sergei set out to investigate why this whole thing had happened. And he came back to us a few weeks after we hired him and said, not only have your companies been stolen, but when the police seized the documents, those documents were then used to create $1 billion of fake contracts to claim your companies owed $1 billion to 3 unknown shell companies. We said, that's pretty terrible. And he said, well, it gets worse. He said, the shell companies then sued your companies for $1 billion in Russian court. You didn't know about it because you didn't own your companies anymore. And then 3 lawyers were hired by the people who stole your companies to show up in court and to plead guilty to $1 billion of fake liabilities. At this point, I was very shocked. Apparently the judges saw nothing unusual about a plaintiff and a defendant immediately agreeing to $1 billion of claims in court. No arguments from the defendant whatsoever. And the judges just stamped the claims and issued $1 billion of judgments against our companies. And then the police, the same police officers who raided our office, then raided all of our banks looking for $1 billion of assets. But thankfully, $1 billion of assets weren't there because we took everything out of the country. And so at this point, I started to nervously laugh to myself and thought, wow, they sure went through a lot of effort for that. Great end to the story. But Sergei said, Russian stories don't end this way. And I said, well, how's this story going to end? And he said, I don't know, but there's never a happy ending to these stories. And I then told him, well, why don't you go and investigate further? And he did. And he came back a few months later, and he said, what I've discovered is truly the most cynical thing I've ever seen in my life in Russia, and I've seen a lot of cynical things. And what he described was truly amazing. That basically, when we were exiting Russia and taking all of our money out, we declared $1 billion of profits to the Russian tax authorities and paid $230 million of taxes. And what Sergei learned was that the people who stole our companies went back to the tax authorities and they said there was a mistake made in the previous year's tax filing. These companies didn't make $1 billion. They made 0. And they presented these bogus court judgments. And they said, since the companies made 0, a mistake was made in paying $230 million of taxes. And we'd like the money back. This was the largest tax refund request in Russian history. They applied for it on the 23rd of December, 2007, 2 days before Christmas. And it was approved and paid out the very next day. The largest tax refund in Russian history paid out one day on Christmas Eve, no questions asked. We were sure that this must be a rogue operation because how could it be possible? Sure, it might have been approved to steal our money, but to steal $230 million of Russian tax money, that had to be a rogue operation. And so we figured if we just filed a complaint with enough different law enforcement agencies, that the good guys would get the bad guys, and that would be the end of this ugly story. And so Sergei prepared criminal complaints. We filed them with like 15 different regulatory and law enforcement agencies in Russia and expected SWAT teams and helicopters to swoop down and get the bad guys the very next day. Well, they organized SWAT teams and helicopters, but not to swoop down and get the bad guys. They started going after all of our lawyers, 7 lawyers from 4 different law firms they opened up criminal cases against. And I could have never imagined that our lawyers would be at risk, and I was deeply troubled by this. And I went to each of our lawyers and I said, I'm sorry this has happened. I understand the danger you must be under, and I think we should get you out of Russia as quickly as possible at my expense so that you're out of harm's way. And it's not an easy conversation to have, to ask a 45-year-old lawyer to leave the country at a moment's notice where maybe doesn't even speak English and go into exile. But 6 of the 7 lawyers that we hired left and came to London. But Sergei said, I'm not leaving. I've not done anything wrong. I know the law backwards and forwards, and I'm going to stay. And moreover, this is not just a crime against you now, it's a crime against my country, and I'm going to testify against the people who committed this crime. In October 2008, he testified against the police officers who did the raid, used it to get the documents to do this crime. And 1 month later, the same police officers came to his home at 8 in the morning in front of his wife and 2 kids and arrested him and put him in pretrial detention and then began to torture him to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in a cell with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day to sleep deprive him. They put him in a cell with no heat and no window panes in Moscow in December, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in a cell with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. And after 6 months of this, he got very ill. He lost 20 kilos. He developed severe pains in his stomach, and he was diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation, which was scheduled for the 1st of August, 2009. 1 week before the operation, his jailers came to him and asked him to sign a confession. And the confession was to say that he stole the $230 million on my instruction. And Sergei was in a very desperate situation at this point, but in spite of his physical pain, he refused to perjure himself and sacrifice his integrity. And he refused to sign this false confession. And in retaliation for that, they abruptly moved him to a prison called Butyrka, which is well known in Russia for being one of the toughest prisons in Russia, and most significantly for Sergei, a place that had no medical facilities. And at Butyrka, his health completely broke down. He went into constant agonizing, ear-piercing pain. And he applied for medical attention on 20 different occasions in writing. And every single one of his applications was either ignored or rejected. They actually rejected in writing his request for medical attention. And on the night of November 16th, 2009, he went into critical condition. They then did move him to a different facility that had an emergency room, but instead of treating him at the emergency room, they put him in an isolation cell and chained him to a bed and allowed 8 riot guards with rubber batons to beat him for 1 hour and 18 minutes until he died. He was 37 years old. Now, how do we know all this? We know it because he wrote it all down. He wrote it all down in the form of 450 complaints that he filed in his 358 days in detention. And as a result of that, we have the most well-documented extrajudicial killing case probably in the last 25 years in Russia. It leaves nothing to the imagination. There is no part of his ordeal that we don't see described in these papers. It says exactly who did it, exactly when they did it, and exactly how they did it. And it's not these documents aren't secret. These documents are now public. And moreover, there's another thing interesting about the Russian system, which is that the people who mistreated him were so concerned about making sure that they satisfied their boss's instructions that there's a document to corroborate everything that Sergei said. And so when he applied for medical attention, there's a rejection document. The use of rubber batons, the authorization for the use of rubber batons to beat him in the last hour of his life. There's a document. There's a document for everything.
Now, Masha, as a journalist in Moscow, when did the Magnitsky case come onto your radar? And how do you interpret the reaction to it? Because we've seen this very mixed reaction with the authorities doing phony investigations, coming out with blustering alternative versions of events, sort of slightly xenophobic, saying that it's just Browder complaining because he lost all his money and so on, and then mostly just silence. Take the story on from there, from your end, and tell us what you've observed and what you've interpreted.
That's a great question. The Magnitsky case came on my radar on November 16th, 2009, when I called. It was in the newswires that I read in the morning. I didn't pay that much attention to it. I called somebody for a comment that I think late that morning or that afternoon, an entrepreneur, he said, there's nothing I'm going to talk about except this lawyer who died today in prison. Called somebody else, got the same response. And that's how I realized that's the story we should be doing that day, and not whatever story we were working on. I have no idea what that story was that we were working on. Despite what you might be seeing in much of the media, this was a case that shook the business community in Russia profoundly the moment it happened. I mean, it was very, very clear. And I was recently in Washington, and I was asked, what does the business community think of the protests? I said, well, what do you think the business community thinks of the protests? The protests are pretty well funded, and they're not funded by the State Department. I said, speaking to a State Department official. And I think that a large part of the reason for that is the Magnitsky case.
Because this was he was the epitome of the new Russian middle class who've done so well out of the change. You do Western-style jobs, Western-style colleagues, Western-style salaries, Western-style everything. And then suddenly, wham, he gets hit by this sort of...
Right. This is, I think, in every period of Russian atrocity, and there have been several, there comes a point when a critical number of people can no longer say to themselves, that's not me. Right? When Khodorkovsky was arrested, people could say, that's not me. And a lot of my businessman friends had long arguments with me saying that that's not me. And I was saying, no, that is you. You just understand that it's you. With Magnitsky, the identification was overwhelming. It was, the message got across to, I think, the entire business class and the entire middle class that you are vulnerable, you're completely defenseless.
And Bill, take up the story on the so-called investigations and the punishments and the promotions of the people involved in the case. What I've just told you, this heartbreaking story, this happens to a lot of people. It's not documented like it is in Sergei's case, but this is, if you meet anybody who's involved in human rights and civil society, there's many stories like it. What brings this story to an international dimension, to an international political level, is what happened afterwards. What happened when the government began their cover-up. Sergei died on November 16th, and as Masha said, and it's so interesting to hear it from her perspective, it just pierced the skin, the thick skin of everybody in Russia. And I remember the really resonant moment, which was that we sent out a 40-page handwritten letter that Sergei had written to the general prosecutor, in which he described a lot of this stuff, which I told you about, and many more things. And by the way, if anyone wants to read it, we have a website called Russian Untouchables, and you can see all these documents on Russian Untouchables. We sent that out, and Novaya Gazeta, one of the bravest independent newspapers, read it, and had a similar reaction to everybody else who read it, which was, this is unbelievable. This can't possibly be Russia 2009. This must be 1937. And they published it word for word on the front page of their newspaper, all 40 handwritten pages, obviously condensed when it was typewritten, over the next several issues, and called it Sergei's Prison Diaries. And this just electrified the Russian population in a way that other things hadn't. And a week afterwards, and there have been a lot of articles in your magazine and in Novaya Gazeta and the New Times and all the independent newspapers about Sergei Magnitsky. And Medvedev, President Medvedev, if you can call him that, president, he was supposed to be the anti-legal nihilism president of Russia. And he had a meeting with a woman named Ella Pamfilova, who was his human rights ombudsman, a week after Sergei died. And he couldn't have not discussed this. And so he did. And he did something which was very unusual, which is he had to do something. And so he called up his general prosecutor and his justice minister and said, I order you to do an investigation into the Magnitsky case. Now, I wasn't sure what to expect in terms of the order. But what it did do, which was something which is unique in Russia, which is that the state media then was allowed to report the name Magnitsky on television. And this is where this thing took off exponentially in terms of a national issue in Russia, which is that
nobody had instructed them not to talk about Magnitsky because the president ordered an investigation. So they all started talking about the name Magnitsky. Now, it was a bit troublesome because for the bad guys, because the bad guys have a system for dealing with this stuff. The system is just say it didn't happen. And so that's what they did. The Interior Ministry announced that Sergei wasn't sick in his time in detention, and that they had no idea that he needed medical attention, and that he died a natural death of natural causes. And it's very unfortunate if someone dies in prison, but it happens. They then exonerated every single one of the officials involved. Every single person from the Interior Ministry, the prosecutor's office, the courts, everyone was exonerated. As the media started whipping this thing further into a frenzy, they needed to more than exonerate them, so they promoted all the key players. When the frenzy got even more whipped up, they actually announced that out of the, I think there was 30 people who received federal honors for their service to the country in the Interior Ministry, and something like 5 of them were the people involved in killing Magnitsky. The thing kept on getting whipped up further and further and further. The president's own Human Rights Council, which consists of really unimpeachable human rights activists, published a report on July 5th of last year, basically saying Sergei had been murdered in custody, he had been tortured, that everyone had been covered up, and they named names all the way throughout. And in response to this, the Interior Ministry again announced that everybody had been exonerated, but then went one step further, and this is the sort of the coup of all sort of craziness and unbelievableness of Russia, which was that they then announced after this Human Rights Council report was published that they were going to resume the prosecution of Sergei Magnitsky 2 years after he's dead. It's the first ever prosecution of a dead man in Russia since the legal system began in 1457. Even Stalin didn't do that.
And I think it may be helpful for people who are familiar with the British system. This is as if you had a really big Russian investor in Britain, like, say, Abramovich, and you then got the Home Office and MI5 and the Inland Revenue getting together to expropriate Chelsea Football Club for Mr. Abramovich, bankrupting it with re-registering it with phony directors, creating liabilities, bankrupting the football club, and then obtaining an enormous tax refund from the Inland Revenue, splitting it up between them, and then jailing and murdering the lawyer who tried to uncover it. And that would be the sort of pretty much...
And then prosecuting that lawyer
and then
after...
prosecute him after he's dead. Yeah. But Masha, back to you. It's when people try and defend Russia, whether or not they're doing it because they're paid to or just out of other motives, they say things like, yes, the Magnitsky case is a tragedy, we have an awfully long way to go in our judicial system and so on, but this is an aberration. It's not it doesn't exemplify anything. It's just like terrible things happen in every country. People die. You have terrible things happen in the American judicial system. You have all sorts of bad things happen. The fact that Medvedev actually did raise it, that it has been discussed in the official media, that at least some people involved were transferred to other jobs, means one shouldn't generalise from this sort of appalling particular instance. Do you think that there's anything to be said on the authorities' side in defence of this, or is this actually a glimpse into the way that Russia really works?
It's absolutely a glimpse into the way Russia really works, and we can sort of logically arrive at this conclusion fairly easily. First of all, human rights activists at this point estimate that as many as 15% of all Russian inmates are entrepreneurs, right? So, and usually, usually their cases are not as convoluted as the Magnitsky case. Usually they're pretty straightforward. It's a conflict between a better connected business partner and a less well-connected business partner, or just somebody who wasn't even a business partner, somebody who wants a business that belongs to somebody else and can use his connections to take over that business. Right? One of the most important organizations in Russia involved in the protests and beyond is an organization called Russia Behind Bars, Russiyadeshe, which is an organization of wives and loved ones of entrepreneurs who are behind bars, right? And that's a palpable presence in the country. So you can see how important a part of our existence that is. That's one thing. And another thing is that if you think about it, I mean the systematic embezzlement that Bill described and the systematic persecution of Sergei Magnitsky would have been impossible if officials at all levels hadn't been involved. I mean, you don't rob the tax police blind or the tax authority blind of $230 million in a day, unless you're in cahoots with somebody who's very high up on the tax police. You don't prosecute a dead man unless you have the full cooperation of the prosecutor general, the prosecutor general, etc. Right? So, in order to have carried out that whole operation, you have to have had the people at the highest levels of government involved.
Just do a quick test of the audience. Hands up, everybody in the audience who had heard of the Magnitsky case before they came here. That's pretty good. Well, the remainder of you've heard about it now. So, and also another quick test. Hands up, everyone in the audience who was born in either Russia or the Soviet Union. Right. Good. Okay. Thanks. Bill, do you want to just talk a little bit now about what's happened since? There's the Magnitsky list has been one of the most effective fires lit under the regime. I think it's far more effective than any of the things that governments or other NGOs have tried to do. Give us a quick update on who's on the Magnitsky list and where have you got them and what's it trying to do?
Well, as you heard, there was really no prospect of getting justice inside of Russia. When Sergei died, I said to myself, I'm going to make sure that he gets justice. That I vowed to his memory, to his family, and to myself that he was going to get justice. And it became obvious very quickly that we weren't going to get justice inside of Russia. And so then we said to ourselves, how do we get justice outside of Russia? There's very little jurisdiction, for tax crimes, torture, and murder in Russia to be executed outside of Russia. And we said to ourselves, well, the people who committed these crimes, they didn't do this because of religious intolerance like the Soviet Union did with Jews. They didn't do it for ideological intolerance the way Stalin did with capitalists. They did this for money. This was a money crime. And as are 15% of all inmates are basically taken hostage for money crimes. And these people, they steal the money. And what do they like to do with their money? The whole thing in Russia, and you can see it everywhere in the world, it's very obvious, is this whole thing, this sort of luxury competition. How do you have more luxury than the next guy? They like to compete with each other to be more luxurious than the next guy. And how do they do that? Well, every frontline house between Monaco and Saint-Tropez has been purchased by a Russian. Half the yachts parked in the marina in the front of the Costa of the Cala di Volpe and the Costa Smeralda in Italy are owned by Russians. In Knightsbridge, you see them everywhere. So if you really want to get to them, take that away from them. And so how do you take that away from them? You take away their visas and you freeze their assets. And so we embarked 2 years ago on a project to do just that. And we know exactly who these people are because they wrote their names down. They signed documents denying Sergei medical care. They signed documents authorizing use of rubber batons. They were more concerned about their bosses not thinking they did their job. Well, now we got the evidence. And so we went to the US government and we asked them to deny visas for the people who killed.
This is 60 named individuals.
60 named individuals. And these are not, I'm not talking, we didn't name Putin, but we named the Deputy General Prosecutor of Russia because he signed a document. We named the Deputy Interior Ministry because he signed a document, and 60 other people. One thing led to another, and I don't want to take too long about this, and we ended up getting a piece of legislation called the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act, which is going through Congress right now. It would freeze assets, cancel visas, and name names of the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky, as well as people who perpetrate other gross human rights abuses. There are 32 senators that have co-sponsored the legislation, half Democrats and half Republicans. And it's now going through in a very interesting time because the US administration is trying to get rid of the very historic, very impressive, and very important piece of legislation called the Jackson-Vanik Act, which was passed 35 years ago, which penalized the Soviet Union for not letting Jewish people emigrate. Obviously, the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore and Jewish people can emigrate, but nobody wants to, in Congress, wants to let Russia off the hook for at the moment because of all the gross human rights abuses, unless there's a replacement piece of legislation. And this one will replace Jackson-Vanik. It's moving forward. It probably, in my prediction, we'll have a piece of legislation passed. And everybody in Europe, we have 12 different parliaments around Europe that have the same thing going. And we are going to close down the West for these people and for hopefully for other people as well.
I want to come to questions in a moment, so start sharpening your questions. But Masha, first of all, I just wonder if you could give us an insight into what the West means for this, for the regime. So it's a real paradox. On the one hand, they fear the West. They think the West's out to get Russia. Russia's a besieged fortress. On the other hand, they envy the West because the West has diversified its economy. It's the source of the consumer goods and the education, the property and the luxury that they want. And in a way, they have also a kind of Soviet feeling. The West is decadent and not as good as Russia in other ways. So can you unpick that a bit for us? What does the West mean for the regime?
Well, I think that I agree with the whole list that you just presented. But more important than anything else, it's the place where they keep their money. It's you can't keep money in Russia. You just heard why you can't keep money in Russia. So if you get money, I mean, there's always somebody who's even better connected than you are. So you still have to take your money out of the country. So it goes to Switzerland, it goes to Liechtenstein, it goes to it goes to the south of France, it goes to London. It has to go out of Russia. So in a way, in addition to all the things you listed, the West is their home. And that's why Bill's scheme is so incredibly effective. It's because it's basically telling them you are not going to be able to go home.
Right. Okay, let's have some questions. If you want to introduce yourself, that's very nice. If you don't want to introduce yourself, that's fine. But what you must, wait for the microphone. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, Alex Goldfarb, thank you very much for your presentations. I have two questions, one for Bill and one for Masha. The question for Bill is that you haven't accounted for the $230 million stolen, who the beneficiaries are. The rumor is that the top man in this pyramid is the Minister of Defense, Mr. Serdikov. Can you comment on that? The question to Masha. There is a debate going on in Washington about the recent surge of anti-Americanism in Russia, which is tremendous. And this is, by the way, something that differs Russia from other oil-rich and gas-rich countries. Most of them are pro-American dictatorships, whereas this is, as I've just mentioned, looks to be anti-American. Now, the American administration, in the person of Mr. McFaul, the US ambassador, has publicly discounted this anti-Americanism, saying that that's nothing. We don't understand why. It's a pre-election tactics, but basically we're big friends. So can you comment on whether this new anti-Americanism or old anti-Americanism is intrinsic? Is it a real soul of Russian regime, or is it just a superficial, temporary thing?
Thanks very much for those excellent questions. Bill, first of all, the great principle in journalism, follow the money. Where did it go?
It's the only question, and we started with the low-level guys, and there was a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Artem Kuznetsov, who was the one who raided our offices, raided the banks, and then arrested Sergei. And we said, well, obviously he's guilty of this crime, so let's see how he's doing. And he wasn't such a clever fellow, because he's on a salary of $10,000 a year. And there's about $3 million of assets registered in him, his wife, and his pensioner mother's name, including some very nice condos and land plots in Moscow, Range Rovers, Mercedes, SLK cabriolets, and lots of foreign trips. His partner at the Interior Ministry, Major Pavel Karpov, he's on a salary of $6,000 a year. He's got $1.3 million of assets. based on public records. But the really funny one is Olga Stepanova, who is the head of tax office number 28 in Moscow that did the lion's share of the big tax refund. She's on a salary, she and her husband, I should say, are on a salary of $38,000 a year based on their tax returns. And they have in their joint possession $38 million worth of assets, including $11 million that was held at Credit Suisse Private Bank in Zurich. And we got the bank statements for that, and we're able to share those with the Swiss general prosecutor, who has since frozen that money and opened up a major money laundering investigation. There's more to come.
Good. Watch this space. There are two people, several standing at the back. We have one seat here.
There was a second part of the question.
Yeah, I know. I'm just good. I didn't like to see people standing when they could be sitting. So we've got two seats there and one there. If you want, don't be shy. Masha, anti-Americanism, is it opportunistic, intrinsic, extrinsic? How does it fit with the 4 years we saw of Medvedev, who seemed to be, and the reset, which seemed to be trying to get relations with America on a different track? Explain.
Right. Putin, who has been running Russia for the last 12 years, just to make it clear, is actually a pretty consistent guy. And he was trained as a spy. He was, the job for which he was trained was drafting potential informants to inform on the enemy, and the enemy was the United States. And that has not changed. The enemy will always be the United States, as long as Putin is in power. It's
the United States.
You're an American. Answer the question. The question was, why doesn't the United States accept this?
Maybe the United States hasn't read my book closely enough yet. No, I mean, I think that look, the whole reset campaign of the last 3 years. I mean, I think that there are a number of officials who fell into the Medvedev trap. They weren't the only ones. There were a lot of very, very good and smart Russians who fell into the same trap. I think that the best way to think of Medvedev, of the Medvedev-Putin duo, is to think of a president who has a first lady, and Medvedev is a first lady. He is he gets to reach out to the disenfranchised, the intelligentsia, the inmates, maybe somebody who's lost an employee. The reaching out doesn't lead to anything. I mean, he's just a first lady. It's just a humanitarian gesture. But that humanitarian gesture, combined with the high office that he supposedly held, it deceived a lot of people. And I would even argue that a lot of people were right to be deceived. I mean, I've talked to people, some that I'm very close to, who said, look, if there's even the slightest chance that I'm going to be able to aid change in the system by participating, say, in Medvedev's Presidential Council on Human Rights, which proved to be a grand waste of time. But the people who participated said, if there's even the slightest chance that I can make a difference by participating, I will participate. And that is a sound position to take. I'm not sure that's a sound foreign policy position, so I have great doubts about the whole reset policy. But I think that the motivation is largely similar.
Right, let's have some more questions. You had your hand up there, sir. Yes, wait for and then we'll take three together, I think, to save time. Then the gentleman next to you, and then the gentleman at the back with the black.
Hi, my name is Oliver Bullough.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to ask, what was unusual, as you said about the Magnitsky case, was that all the information came out, and there's so many, thousands of cases where no one really has any clear idea about what happened. I wondered whether it's ever going to be possible to hold sort of Putin or his officials to account, since they've become so good at controlling the flow of information, and whether, an act like this about Magnitsky is essentially unworkable because no one really has any idea what's going on.
Good, and then if you pass the microphone along, yes, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, hello, I'm Mick Brown. Two questions. One to Bill about how did you acquire the documents, the 42 pages of documents, and to Masha, what do you think the prospects are now for the protest movement in light of Putin's re-election?
And finally, the lady in the black there, yes, go ahead.
Thanks. My name is Maya Trajkovska, but I wasn't born in Russia or the Soviet Union. I have a comment and I have a question to Masha. My comment refers to the Christmas Eve. It's not on the 23rd, it's on the 16th of January in Russia. So they had 2 weeks instead of 1 day. And the question to Masha is actually, I'm interested in the comment that where you said that Russia faces imminent collapse. So I would like you to expand on this statement of yours. Thanks.
Okay, let's get to Bill first. Without giving away too much of your sources and methods, how did you get hold of these very interesting documents?
Well, the documents were something that people often ask. It's not an unusual question, which is how did Sergei's Sergei's diaries, is what you're referring to. How did they allow that to happen? And Russia, on one hand, is totally a lawless place where they can do all these terrible things that I've described. But on the other hand, and this is really important, they're totally wedded to procedure. And even during Stalin's times, they had to get a confession. They had to beat a confession or torture a confession out of somebody and get them to initial every page before they executed them. And they allowed him to file his complaints. And so every month or so, he'd give a stack of complaints that he wrote by hand in his cell with his pencil to his lawyer. His lawyer would file the complaints. They would be ignored or rejected, and we'd get copies of them. And
just to follow up on the Christmas Eve point, the tax refund was paid out on Western Christmas Eve.
Western Christmas Eve.
Which is that's a symbolic rather than an act.
No, it has nothing to do with Russian Christmas. And then to answer your question about the my goal. If people say, well, what? So I've been on this campaign for 2 years. What's my goal? And my end goal is not just to get sanctions. That's just an intermediate goal. What I'd like to do, and part of the reason why I carry on doing this day in, day out, is that I believe, and this will go into a question that Masha will answer in a second, is I believe that the regime is not a sustainable regime when they're stealing money, when they have 10,000 people stealing all the money and 140 million people living in poverty. And I believe that the regime will change, whether it takes 2 months, 2 years. Masha can probably comment better than me on that. But when the regime does change, I want the Magnitsky case to be, when they set up the provisional new Russian government, I want them to have the tribunals of the crimes of the previous regime start off with Magnitsky case, and that's my goal. And I think that we'll get justice eventually, as we've seen in Egypt and various other places. That this case, I want every detail of this case to be so well known that they want to do this as an act of symbolic defiance against the crimes of the previous regime.
Masha, we've got this question really has 3 elements. There was a question about the protesters and where they go. Is this fizzling out, just taking a breather? What happens there? And then there's the question of the regime and its durability, which may be different from Putin and his durability. Can you imagine that we could have this sort of kleptocratic ex-KGB regime without the first person, that they could push him aside and trying to renew themselves, bring in another first lady, another Medvedev or something? Or do you think they go down together? And what's the time scale? How long have they got?
Right. Yeah, I should make it clear, I did not say that Russia is near collapse. I said that the regime is near collapse. I do think it's facing imminent collapse. It may, as Bill said, take 2 months. It may take 2 years. I can't see that it taking more than that. How do I justify that opinion? There's, as I said, the regime is structured like a pyramid. And in order for the corruption to function, you need small-scale corruption at the bottom to enable huge corruption at the top. You need the participation of low-level bureaucrats to carry out things like the falsification of elections. Now, here's an interesting point. It's been very widely reported that the presidential election on March 4th was brazenly rigged, and it was. But it was brazenly rigged in a new way, because the old way stopped working. Right? They created all these supplementary voter rolls. They created phantom election precincts, because they could no longer count on the low-level state employees, teachers, and school principals who staff local election commissions to just automatically falsify results, right? So the bottom level of the pyramid is being dissembled before our very eyes. Now, the problem with what has happened in Russia over the last 12 years is that all the healthy mechanisms of society, of a democratic society, have been demolished. Right, so the electoral institutions are destroyed, public space has been destroyed, the media have been silenced, right? So you don't even. It's like having a person in multiple organ failure. You don't quite know how the internal organs are going to communicate among themselves because they don't anymore. So even though the bottom of the pyramid has fallen out, we can't quite predict when the top is going to collapse. Because actually they're not talking to each other anymore. Because it's that bad. The destruction is that far gone. I think that was the demise question. What was that?
What about the opposition?
What about the opposition? Right. The opposition. It was inevitable that the protest movement would wax and wane. It's waning right now. It will wax again. I am sure of this. Because the motivation for the protest has not gone anywhere. And the motivation for the protest, and we should be very clear about this, is the humiliation, the daily indignity of living in Russia, of which the rigging of the elections is but a last drop, a small example. But it's really the daily experience of going to get your driver's license extended, going to get your passport, or going to get a license for your business to import millions of dollars worth of raw materials. Whatever it is you're doing to when you have contact with the state, it's humiliating, it's unpredictable. And that's why people came out into the streets. And that's not gone anywhere. Now, because political culture has been destroyed over the last 12 years, a large number of people, and I think I was very naive about this, sort of the opposite kind of naivete from the kind that I'm about to describe, but a large number of people engaged in a sort of magical thinking. It seemed to them that if there are so many of us and we're out in the streets and the protest is happening, then the whole thing is going to end right now. Well, it didn't end right now. Because again, there are no mechanisms for the protest to bring down the regime. So right now, some of the people are demoralized, others are radicalized, and that's a very important part of the picture. But both groups are sort of trying to figure out where we go from now, and we are going to go somewhere from now. It's the regime, the integrity of the regime has been destroyed.
Right, let's have some more questions. The lady in the front, yes, two ladies in the front row.
My name is Alisa. I'm just was wondering, if regime collapse, where do you see Khodorkovsky? And do you think that Prokhorov will survive politically for the next election?
And the lady next to you?
I'm Galia Kutranova, Tier Fund. My question is to Bill. How many organizations are you aware of that are doing similar activities to you, Western organizations? And will the West eventually give up on Russia and its lawlessness? Can you comment on that?
Okay, one each, go ahead.
Okay, it's hard to say. I mean, what we do know is that, again, because political institutions have been destroyed, there's this, this commonly used rhetorical device. Well, where are the leaders in the opposition? Who's going to take over? Well, nobody, because political institutions have been destroyed, media have been destroyed. There's no public conversation. You need to rebuild all that stuff to get new leaders. Does Khodorkovsky have the potential to be one of those new leaders? Possibly, but we won't know until we see how it all shakes down. We don't know who lives in the country anymore. That all needs to be seen and counted and discussed again. Now, Prokhorov has...
Explain who Prokhorov is for
right.
the people who Mars.
Oh, yeah, you people are not from New York. You don't know who Prokhorov is. Mikhail Prokhorov was the richest man in Russia 3 years ago. Now he's the 4th richest man in Russia. So he has more money than God. He's also the owner of the Brooklyn Nets, in the worst team in the NBA. Anyway, he's a billionaire who was he's also one of the tallest men in Russia, who ran for president in the last election, the one that just happened, which means that he was asked to run by the Kremlin, because nobody runs without having that arranged with Putin. And despite having run anything but a vigorous campaign, He did, according to independent exit polls, come in second. And it makes it clear that at the moment he's got great potential just because he is not Putin. I think also because people feel that he can be trusted because he already has all that money. So at least he's not going to steal. So that means that in the short run, his political potential is huge. He would actually be a wonderful choice for the head of transitional government because he would, in fact, make a credible case for being able to limit his political ambition to, say, a 2-year transitional period. And you know, he can also at least run a business. We know that. So maybe he can go some way toward do something toward building institutions in the country. Does he have potential in the long run? It's impossible to tell because we don't know what's happening in the country in the long run.
We need a proper political contest before we can see how people do.
Exactly.
Bill, just quickly answer the
So the question was, how many other Western organizations are doing the kind of things I'm doing, and when's the West going to give up on Russia? The West is never going to give up on Russia because for a variety of reasons. The main reason is that, as Masha said at the very beginning, this is a country with more nuclear warheads than the second largest owner of nuclear warheads, and most of the heating gas for Europe. And so whatever happens, everyone always cares about Russia. In terms of who else is doing what I'm doing, to really make a big change like what we're trying to do in terms of punishing these Russian officials abroad, you can't do it. One man can't do that. And we came up with this idea which just took off virally, which is this idea that their money is where their heart is at. And I would say that there's probably across the world, there must be 150 organizations that one way or another are involved in lobbying, helping, and facilitating this sanctions legislation all over the place. And what's most remarkable is in Washington, when we took this law, the Magnitsky Law, and it started out as just a Magnitsky Law, just for Sergei Magnitsky, and about 10 or 12 victims of other atrocities came forward to Senator Cardin and McCain, who were the co-sponsors of this law, saying, could you add our persecutors? And when we broadened it, people fanned out across Capitol Hill lobbying for this. And basically everybody, and not just foreigners, but Russians going to Washington, are all lobbying for the same thing. Everyone has found the one thing, the Achilles heel, the thing that they care about. And that's why I'm so optimistic that this is going to happen, is because we finally found the policy that makes these guys squirm.
Gentleman in the front row, and then Masha in the stripy black and white. So I'll give her a... Go ahead, sir.
Just sorry to go backwards, Christopher McLeod. Do you think there is a possibility that Irina Prokhorova might be not only a much better leader, whether transitional or eventual, for Russia than her brother?
No.
At all?
No.
That was a very specific question, very short answer. Masha, go ahead.
I've got 3 questions, but some of them are quite brief. One is, Masha, about your book. I was wondering about the period of Putin in Leningrad before he came to Sobchak, but when he was a KGB officer, because I know somebody who distinctly remembers how Putin was present at the surge in his flat. He was a Leningrad dissident. For reasons of his own, he doesn't speak about it. But I just wonder whether you managed to research about this period of his life and found any people who had similar experience. That's question number 1. Question number 2 is to Bill. Why are you so positive that the Congress will support the Magnitsky Law when we know that President Obama is so reluctant to link human rights and relationship with Russia? Or do you hope that it will happen with the next administration if it comes after him? And the third question is both to Masha and to Edward, because I know that you also supported this idea that Putin might have to go within the next 2 years. what sort of scenario can you envisage when the regime is fighting so hard for survival, while the people in Russia, apart from a certain group of people, are really not that eager to
Masha,
fight?
if I didn't love you so much, Masha, I'd have shut you up. And in future,
so, well,
in future,
that's it.
one question per person, strictly. So you've got about 20 minutes to go. But as you did ask 3, we will, and I shall abuse my position as chair and say, I think that Putin will be at his weakest when there's next a crisis. Something like another Kursk, a television tower catching fire, a hydroelectric power station blowing up, something just going wrong. Because he handles these crises quite badly. And I think that will create a moment of vulnerability, which in the past he's always got out of because of his huge personal popularity. It's been this strange cognitive dissonance that if you ask Russians, well, do you think health, education, transport, criminal justice, anything is good, they all say, no, it's bad. Corruption, the rest of it. But if you say, do you like Putin? They say yes. And that's what's changed now. That bubble has popped. So I think that creates vulnerability. And I wouldn't say hypothesis, but the possibility is that the people who've got a huge stake in the survival of the regime may wonder if they can perpetuate it a bit longer by pushing him sideways or downwards, or possibly even he should taste his tea very carefully before he drinks it or whatever. Masha.
Right. Okay, which question am I answering?
Any of Masha's 3 questions.
What will ultimately bring him down? Well, first of all, I think there's a false premise at the base of your question, which is that there's only a certain group of people who are involved in the protest. That's absolutely not true. The protest movement has been a true broad-based movement. And that's true at the top and at the bottom. At the top, you see, left-wing radicals and 90s rightist liberals sitting down at the same table for the first time ever, consistently, sustainably, working against the regime. That's unprecedented, and it's huge. At the street level, you see the same thing. I mean, there was a very significant thing done on December 24th during the protest in Moscow, when the organizers actually commissioned a poll. And the poll showed that, contrary to conventional wisdom, which is that it's just the middle class, it was a cross-section of working age Muscovites, right? So 15 to 61, well, it was Moscow, so they were Muscovites. I mean, 18% were Moscow region. Right, but obviously a majority live in Moscow because it was in Moscow. But they all levels of income, all levels of education. 7% below poverty level. Only 5% wealthy. That's pretty much Moscow. Right. Right, and that's true across the country. 99 cities outside of Moscow participated in the protests. Including tiny towns like Kovrov, population 145,000.
That's tiny by Russian standards.
Right. Well, population 145,000, that's the scale of a town where people know one another. 120 people came out to protest. Yeah. That's nearly 1/10% of the population of the town. That's a huge protest. And that's happened across the country.
Bill, just deal with the question, what happens if as with many things that Congress votes for, the administration says, sorry, national security, we can't do it?
Well, so let's just imagine this, Masha. Here's the question for Obama: is he going to veto in an election year a piece of legislation banning Russian torturers and murderers from coming into America?
Right. Okay. Now, the gentleman with the white beard has been very patient, and then the gentleman in the blue shirt. Go ahead, sir.
Gary Bush. My question is really, almost everything I read in the papers and I hear people discussing is based in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Now, when I lived in Russia, no one cared about Moscow and St. Petersburg. You got across the Urals, they couldn't care what happened. It was monuments and politicians. Why suddenly is it going to happen that the rest of Russia is going to get themselves involved in something which they really have not got the same kind of stake in? The next thing, just as an aside, when you're talking about Putin in Leningrad, and the vision of the KGB. He wasn't really a KGB, but he was in the 5th Division. He was the Stukach with all the people. The rest of the people in the KGB didn't look upon him.
You mean he's a counterintelligence officer rather than a real spy?
Yeah, and they didn't look upon him. And then they actually talked down to him. And this is one of his problems.
Okay, gentleman in the blue shirt.
So what do you think of the thesis of Litvinenko's book, Blowing Up Russia? I mean, Berezovsky's thesis, of course, which the book Litvinenko. I mean, is a valid conspiracy thesis that Litvinenko or Berezovsky is putting forward or not?
Okay, let's have more questions. Who else? There's a hand up there. Yes, the white shirt.
For Bill Browder, can I just ask, with such a political and economic system that is rotten to the core and corrupt to the core, to what extent did you assess the risks before you actually invested $4 billion in the former Soviet Union?
Right. Go ahead, Bill. That's one for you first, then two for Masha.
When I first got started investing, we didn't invest $4 billion. We invested $25 million. And I told everybody, and it wasn't my money, it was the money of my clients. They gave me the money to manage. And the economic proposition was, this stuff is so cheap, it was trading at a 99.7% discount to assets in the West, that I said, all it has to do is go down to like a 97% discount and you've made 10 times your money. And I thought, if they don't take it away from you, you'll make 10 times your money. And if they do take it away from you, you'll lose your money. And there's probably, let's say there's a 50-50 chance of making 10 times your money or losing it. That's probably a pretty good bet. It turned out that my clients made about 35 times their money, not in spite of this tragedy. It was a very economically prosperous thing. But it was all so cheap back then, and everybody assumed that the risks were completely there. And in fact, the risks were overestimated. And we never thought that the government would be involved in stealing their own money. I mean, this was such a convoluted, sort of twisted scheme. It goes beyond just taking my stuff.
In a way, it would be less bad if they just stolen it from you as a foreign investor. Foreign investors get ripped off in lots of countries. It was the stealing from that other people.
Right. That's what's so strange about this whole thing. It wasn't my money. I didn't lose any money. I lost something much more precious than money, which is the life of a young man. But I didn't lose any money.
Now, two questions to you, Masha. First of all, this question of whether what's happening mainly in Moscow and St. Petersburg has any resonance in the rest of Russia. And then this fascinating question about the apartment plot. Does everybody know what we're talking about here with the apartment block bombings?
I'll go through it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, just because most Western reporters are too lazy to leave Moscow and St. Petersburg does not mean that what they don't see is not happening. Again, 99 cities involved in the protests. That's all of Russia, right? Russia, that's pretty much how many cities Russia has. The protests have engulfed the entire country. And yes, we expect that to I expect that to have an effect, because that's going on throughout the entire country. Now, with the apartment buildings, in August and September 1999, there were 4 consecutive explosions in Moscow and in the south of Russia that killed over 300 people and injured over 1,000. And there's this theory that has been put forward by a number of people, including indeed Boris Berezovsky, including Alexander Litvinenko, that those explosions were organized by the secret police. I think there's overwhelming evidence that that is indeed the case. We can't talk about conclusive evidence, because we can't talk about conclusive evidence.
Just explain, why would the FSB want to kill more than 300 Russians?
It was a very primitive and very effective ploy to mobilize the country in fear and create an instant base of support for somebody who, to most people, had not existed 2 weeks earlier. Right? There was this faceless man who had been appointed prime minister, young, gray, unqualified, had never held elected office, came out of absolutely nowhere, he needed to be catapulted to power. And he needed to be catapulted to power because he was handpicked by Yeltsin, who was besieged at the time, who was facing losing his office. Well, he had to because he was serving at the end of his second term, which was the last allowed by the Constitution. But what he was facing was probable prosecution by the opposition that would have come to power after he lost office. So he needed to create an instant power base out of this faceless man, having no political basis of support in the country whatsoever. So they reverted to a technique that had been tried before, that has proven effective not just in Russia but in other countries.
And was tried last autumn in Belarus.
Right.
Yeah.
Get people really, really scared. And there are few things that can make people as scared as seeing people just like them, in the commuter suburbs of large cities, being blown up in their apartments in the middle of the night as they sleep.
And it's also worth pointing out that everybody who's investigated this has ended up dead or in jail.
Right.
Yeah.
And then 2 weeks later, there's this incident in the
Sorry, so I'm going to have to be very disciplined.
city, which was the security service officers.
Right. I mean, that's one of the bits of evidence. I kind of decided not to go into it because I think it would take up our time. Suffice it to say that there's overwhelming evidence that this was indeed organized by the secret police.
And Masha explains it all very well in her book, which is going to be on sale in just a few minutes, with a signature from the author for a very reasonable price of £20. Yes, we're going to take. I'm just going to take 3 or 4 very quick questions, and then we're going to stop. So, lady there, go ahead.
Mr. Browder, I have a question. Which year you entered Russian waters as far as business is concerned?
1996.
Quite an experience you had in Russia before you actually had this wonderful Magnitsky list. I take off my hat for what you've done. But I do have a question. I don't know how to say. Why you became disillusioned only in 2005 when all this corruption and terrible things were happening in Russia in front of your eyes. All the years before that, death of, for example, Yuri Shikachyhin, who investigated big corruption with KGB and Sri Kitab, these shops and arms and God knows what, so lots of things happening. And you were successful until 2005. So when Khodorkovsky unfaithful trial happened, not that Khodorkovsky was not, what I'm trying to say, and why this Magnitsky story became, why didn't you start big noise earlier when he was just arrested?
Very
Thank
fair question for Bill. We'll take a few more. Who else? Any more hands going up? Anyone think this is all complete? Yes, go ahead, sir.
I've got 2 questions for Bill.
One.
One. I've got to pick one.
Okay,
so obviously it's quite a long list. There's over 60 people in the Magnitsky list. And it's understandable that you, in your own right, to deny them visas and everything. But effectively, all those people get implicated in murder. And there has been no trial and no proper investigation. Do you think that is fair to take all 60 people murders?
Okay, not all murders, some just fraudsters.
Can I just a question to Masha? The potential for a trigger of any change of political regime in Russia is inevitably going to be oil, because that's what's fueling the wealth of the country, the popularity of Putin. Wages are growing double digits at the moment. This is all fueled by oil, and there's no likelihood that this is going to be falling back to levels we've seen in the past. This is a new world. So, if that's, for me, the single trigger that would cause any political change in this country, you're going to be waiting a long time, I would put forward.
Great. Okay, Bill, 2 questions for you. Why did you get cross with the regime only when they turned on you?
Well, I think that it's a little bit unfair to me to say that I was only cross with the regime when they turned on me. I was cross with the regime the moment that they started stealing money from big Russian companies, and for people like Ed who knew me in Moscow, I spent most of my career screaming from the loudest rooftop about how crooked and corrupt Gazprom, Spearbank, Unified Energy Systems, and various other things were.
But you also said that Russia was moving in the right direction and it was underappreciated in the West.
And I think it was true. I think that from 2000 to 2004, and I should just, for those of us living in Russia, during the oligarch regime, when 22 guys ended up with the whole country and everyone else was living in destitution, and professors became taxi drivers and nurses had to become prostitutes, there was nobody who could put their hand on their heart and say that this was good. And so we were all screaming for a strong man to come in and take these oligarchs out. And so for a brief period of time, I was enthusiastically supporting the strong man who was supposed to be doing that. And I was even happy when they arrested Khodorkovsky, because he was one of the guys who was causing so much trouble to me when I was doing all this stuff. The time when I got angry was when, after they arrested Khodorkovsky and took his company away, they then gave to Roman Abramovich $13 billion for another oil company. Why didn't they take that one away from him? Why is it that one guy gets thrown in jail and another guy gets $13 billion? And that's when things started going really wrong. And I don't think it was just me who was coming to this conclusion. I think a lot of people have come to this conclusion over a period of time. And just to answer your question about there are people in Russia in the administration, the presidential administration, and the foreign ministry that say it's really unfair that we're calling 60 people haven't been prosecuted, and therefore how can we say that they're involved in these crimes? And those 60 people will never be prosecuted in the current regime in Russia, because the courts were part of the system, and so it's ridiculous to even assume that they could be prosecuted in Russia. And we're not asking to throw anybody in jail here. We're just saying a visa, which is a privilege, not a right, should not be granted to somebody where there's documentary evidence of their involvement, where there's a relatively good case to be made for their involvement in a fraud, a false arrest, a torture, and a murder.
Masha, do you want to finish up on is the oil price the regime's ultimate Achilles heel? Because they've had this incredible, I mean, Bill was saying the 90s was bad, but I often think if the Yeltsin governments had Putin's oil price and Putin's governments had Yeltsin's oil price, history would look completely different.
I completely agree. Well, first of all, I want to set the record straight. Not all of us were screaming for a strong man. Some of us who were very much protesting the introduction of a strong man. In fact, some of us thought that with all the irregularities of the privatization of the 1990s, it's still an open question whether there was a better way to do it. But by the end of the 1990s, the system had begun to right itself, and the people who had come into possession of much of the country's wealth, most of them had realized that if they just kept taking that money out and putting nothing back in, they would run out of money eventually. In fact, the person at the forefront of that transformation was Khodorkovsky. And I would argue that those few of us who were against the strongman from the beginning turned out to be right. As for the oil price, here's the thing. As I said, the system is a pyramid. So it needs more than a sustained high oil price to run. It needs a constantly growing price of oil to run. Yeah. And that's not going to happen for it forever.
Well, on that cheerful note, there's a bar downstairs with wonderful drinks. Some of you were going to go and have a delicious dinner there as well, or the many fine hostelries round about the Frontline Club. So it just remains me to first of all say that my own book is also on sale here. Please buy it. Thank you very much. It's about spies, a subject we have barely touched on, which complements everything you've heard this evening. Bill's websites are fantastic. Just Google Russian Untouchables. Go there. It will give you nightmares, so don't do it last thing at night. But it's all on there. It's in English if you don't speak Russian. It's really moving, grueling stuff. And Masha's book is absolutely terrific. And one copy is not enough. Buy one for yourself and one for your friends. And thank you very much indeed.